we have Kate Bahn, who's the chief economist. Yes, economist. I want to hug all economists. And SVP of research at, guess what? One of my favorite organizations, the Institute for Women's Policy Research, also known as IWPR. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you for having me, Kristen. And you are also one of our illustrious board members. So it's exciting to talk to you.
Yay. Lucky to serve.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about jobs, the
Mm.
economy, the unaffordability crisis. We saw some trends in the recent job report, which we know already Donald Trump has said he's suppressing some of the data in the job reports on purpose. So it's not the full picture that show
Mhm.
that many women are being pushed out of the economy at an increased rate. What is happening in the recent jobs report, and what is that information that Donald Trump is trying to suppress? I just, as an aside, I'm trying to understand sort of what are we looking at as the data, and then what does the
Yeah.
data that we can see say?
Yeah. I'll start with the first thing, sort of what the recent jobs report it was, what was it like in the little bit sort of medium, longer term. And then I'll get to the technical piece because it's a little bit the type of question you have to ask an economist because it's quite technical what's happening here.
I'm
But to
so
start, so
excited that you're on because you can answer those technical questions. Okay, ready
yeah.
to you.
Um, so the thing was actually last jobs report, it was first of all, it was delayed because of the temporary shutdown, partial shutdown that happened. So it came out a little later than usual. And it was better than expected. And so, we have to concede that at 130,000 jobs were added when the expectations are going to be about 50,000, which has been the recent average. So it was a lot more jobs than we typically expected. Black women's unemployment really has been really, really high the past year, but it decreased to 6.3%, down from 7.3%. That's a really large drop, a whole percentage point drop in unemployment for Black women. And all groups of women added jobs last month, except for Asian women. Um, so overall, that is, a pretty one of the best jobs reports we've seen in a while. But the piece here that is a little bit messy and complicated is that, collecting data and using statistical methods to analyze what's happening in the economy is always a little bit of an art in addition to a science. And so the way they do this is that they release the initial numbers when they first get them, and then they do a lot of revisions. They continually revise the data to make sure it's more accurate and more accurate. And what they do usually for the January data when they release it is they do revisions based on what they know about how the population has changed in the entire country over the past year. And they'll often pull from administrative data. So things like the government has access to data on how many workers are employed because they have to have unemployment insurance coverage. And so they'll have those measures where they can say, okay, this is how many people we surveyed, but this is what we know about the growth of the labor market and changing trends in the labor market. Let's align these two to make sure that our estimations are more accurate. And usually when they release that data with the January data, with those revisions, they did not do the population revisions this time. We're expecting that to come out in the next jobs report, but that's still pretty unusual to not receive that data. And we really, really need that revised data to get a full picture of what's happening. That's how we sort of understand what's happening.
Why
But
are so many women being pushed out of the labor force?
yeah, well, so it's a lot. This is the longer term piece, is that while the last month was good data, longer term, we are seeing really troubling signs for women workers and particularly Black women workers. And so, well publicized last year is that between January and August, over 250,000 Black women lost employment. It is, we now are positive year over year, but we don't know how many new entrants came to the labor force, how many Black women graduated high school and college that would want jobs. And what we see happening here is in that period of time from January to August, Black women made up over half of all the jobs lost, even though they're only 14% of women workers. So that's just a huge amount of Black women being driven out of the labor force. And what we did at IWPR is we're really interested in that sort of why are they being driven out? What is happening underlying this? And we went in and we looked at a couple different factors. We looked at what jobs are declining in the economy, and we found that a lot of these sort of professional business services jobs are declining, particularly for women, and Black women are overrepresented in those jobs. So a sector that's decreasing, you find more Black women there. And then they also are losing jobs, even given their overrepresentation in that sector at a higher rate. Another really important piece is healthcare. We know that women are overrepresented in healthcare jobs, and Black women in particular, other women of color, but the healthcare sector has been leading job growth, but at a decreasing pace. And so healthcare used to add, gangbusters numbers of jobs per month. They're still adding jobs per month, but many, many fewer. And so there's less demand for healthcare workers then. And so that's going to also make it harder for women to have opportunities. And the last one I'll mention is our friends at the National Partnership for Women and Families also have some great work looking at mothers in the labor force. So obviously of particular interest to your audience. But we are finding things like mothers with children under 5 have had their labor force participation decreased by 1.4%, which is troubling. That's not a huge sounding number, but that's still pretty troubling. But for Black women, it's 2.8%. So Black women in particular who are mothers of young children are really being driven out of the labor force. So I said those are the two things. It's the types of occupations that are growing or not growing. And then we're really finding that something is happening now with mothers of young children, that they are being pushed out.
And I'm so glad that you're using the framing pushed out, because we know that three-quarters
Mhm.
of families need the wages of moms to make
Mhm.
ends meet. Again, three-quarters of families need the money that moms bring in to put a roof over the heads of their children,
Mhm.
to put food on the table. And sometimes the far right is framing this as moms are deciding to leave the labor force. But what we are hearing from actual moms
Mhm.
is they're literally being pushed out, and they're being pushed out because costs are going up. The cost of
Mhm.
childcare, which allows parents to go to work, allows kids to thrive, and allows businesses to not have supply chain disruptions and disruptions in the running because they don't have empty vacancies in their staffing, are all do better when we have access to childcare. So
Mhm.
know that childcare is important. We also know that it's increasingly unaffordable. And we also know that the Trump administration and Republicans have been trying to push policy forward that undermines access to childcare, which, by the way, undermines parent choice. It takes away our choice to be able to survive and thrive, or, to really struggle. So parents are getting pushed out of the labor force because of the increase in childcare costs. Honestly, the increase in
Mhm.
food costs, even coffee is up 33%, as well as healthcare crisis, which healthcare costs are going up. So, from an economist's perspective, how does the increasing costs push parents, especially moms, out of the labor force, even though those families need those wages in order to thrive and survive?
And it's those increasing costs plus the lack of public support for it. And so I think that's like a key piece here too, is that families need access to care supports, like childcare, health care, elder care. We know these are determinants of how much women participate in the labor force because women take on the responsibility of those duties. We know those prices go up at above the rate of inflation. And so even when we're looking at an inflation rate of 2.4%, those prices are going up at a much higher rate. Um, and there's no public support. And so this is what I think, is a key point, and I bring it up all the time, is that the US is the only advanced economy with declining women's labor force participation. And the reason for that is because we don't have public policies that support women's ability to give care to their families. And in those positions, when you're backed into a corner, you got to do what you got to do. And what it seems like is happening in the current moment is that women are being pushed out of the workforce. And this is going to have huge spillover effects. Sort of as you mentioned, 75% of families are relying on women's wages. There's research that shows that family incomes would have declined in the last 50 years if not for the fact that women have increased how much they work. And so families are depending on this. This is like critical to family economic security, critical to overall economic thriving in our economy. And it's just an untenuous situation. Sort of what I think is like we just reached a threshold where like women can no longer function under these conditions. We need something to change.
Yeah, something needs to change, and it's easy to change. We're one of the only
Mhm.
industrialized nations without universal access to childcare, to paid family medical leave after a new baby arrives, to health care, to earned sick days. More than 90% of countries in the
Mhm.
planet Earth have access to earned sick days. Right now, more than 70% of low-wage mom workers don't even have a single paid sick day, even if, a kid is in the hospital or they have the flu and can't be at work. In fact, presenteeism, which means going to work sick, is costing our economy much more than it would cost if we
Hmm.
just had earned sick days. I am so mad because these are all solutions that not only help moms and parents stay in much needed jobs, but also lower the wage gaps between moms
Hmm.
and non-moms, which then boosts our economy overall. One of my favorite stats is IWPR had a stat a while ago that said that our GDP would be increased by 5% if we had pay parity, and if people who wanted to work could work. What is the stat these days, or is that the same?
It's probably about the same, is that we know that we are not using all the talent we have in our economy. And if we did, I mean, by not having women have opportunities, and if we did, it would lead to better economic growth in the range of 5%. But that's a pretty big amount. If you compare that to the like that we're expecting GDP growth figures coming out this week to be around maybe 3%. So that is a pretty big jump in GDP.
It's big. One the other thing that I often talk about, but I love to talk about with a real economist, is that the wages and the consumer purchasing of moms and women actually make our economy go. So
Mhm.
70% and upwards of our economy is based on consumer purchasing, and women and moms make the majority of consumer purchasing decisions. So if we don't have money to spend, if we can't do that consumer purchasing, buying the apples, buying the school lunches, buying the shoes when our kids' feet grow bigger, which of course they hopefully always do, then we actually undermine the whole economy along the way. And could you rephrase that in an actual economist's
Yeah.
explanation?
The technical term is marginal propensity to consume is the technical term. And we know that, so basically what it means is that if you have one extra dollar, how much are you going to spend that extra dollar? And for moms, they are going to spend a really high portion of that extra dollar because they have so many things that they need to pay for. And so we know that this is exactly why things like increasing to SNAP funding, increasing to unemployment insurance, they have such a big bang for your buck because when you give people money for food, money for supporting their families, they spend it. So it's good for the overall economy. And so it is another technical term. It's a counter-cyclical policy because if the economy is starting to go down a little bit, but then you give people money to spend, they're going to spend it and it's going to help the economy. And so, I mean, you're exactly right. It's that when mothers have a higher marginal propensity to consume, they prop up the economy and support economic growth.
And it's so important, right? It's so
Hmm.
important, and people do not realize how important it is. Also,
Hmm.
while we have you on, in a minute and 50 seconds, we need to explain why there is no such thing as trickle down. This is something that
Yes.
people think about, and it goes
Hmm.
along with the marginal propensity that you're just talking about. So,
Hmm.
to you,
Yes, I mean, you're exactly right. And so, there's this idea that if people have money, they're going to, at any level, they're going to spend money and invest it, start new businesses. And then we found out that's not what happens. People hoard wealth. They are not investing it in new businesses, and they're hoarding wealth. And so when that happens, is like there's a lot of lost potential in the economy when people hoard their wealth. And so what we found is it's in fact quite the opposite. If you give money to lower income people, that is going to lead to a more robust, resilient economic growth rather than just hoping that it's going to trickle down through investment by very wealthy people, because that has not happened so far.
yeah, I mean, in decades and decades and decades and decades of research has proven time and time again that there is no trickle down, meaning
Yep.
that when you give super wealthy people access to more money, access to more tax breaks, what Kate said is absolutely true. They do not spend it immediately. Usually it goes into a bank because
Hmm.
guess what? It turns out you can only buy so many shoes for your kids, right? A billionaire does
Hmm.
not need a billion shoes. So oftentimes that's going into investments and it doesn't fuel the economy. It's not spent in the economy. And those investments, are stuck in a bank over time instead of moving our economy forward. So if anybody ever tells you the trickle down is happening, just tell them we know that is a myth, not a
Hmm.
reality. So really quickly, IWPR, how can people get involved?
Go to iwpr.org, check out our research, share our research, tell us what you think about our research, because what we really want is for people to see their own lives in the work we're doing, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to illuminate what's happening in people's lives to spur changes to policies. And so I just want people to engage with it and tell us what they think.
Yes, get involved with IWPR, support IWPR. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you so much.